Hey everybody, Nam here, and welcome back to another episode of NamNotes, where today we're going to be talking about savings bonds, treasury bonds, and SGOV. And if none of those meant anything to you, well, you should probably listen to the whole thing. And if all of them meant something to you, this might be too basic, so you probably don't need to know it. Let's go ahead and get into story time. I had a bunch of savings bonds. I don't want to say rotting in my house, but they were basically in my house in a place long forgotten. Due to some unexpected free time last year, I was able to go back and find them, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. Taking a look at them, they were these old savings bonds that my mom got me for helping me pay for college. Now, it's been an awful long time since I've been in college, and I paid off my student loans a while ago. Now, also just to tell you how absurd this was, I obviously had found them at some point in the past, like decade and a half or so, and I put them in an envelope. Now, I kid you not, I put them in an envelope marked, "Don't open until 2023." In which case, it had already been a couple of years past 2023 anyway. So I looked at my options to see what I could do with them, and the most prudent course of action is you take them to the bank, and then the bank will either cash or deposit them for you. And here's what I didn't really understand. I didn't really understand what the process for getting a savings bond was and what the difference between a savings bond and a treasury bond, because I believe that a savings bond is a subset of a treasury bond. Down the rabbit hole of financial bonds I went. I'm just going to put a disclaimer now. I'm not a financial expert. I don't know anything about finances, but I've tried to teach myself as much as I can. And the purpose of this audio episode is so that I can talk about this. And if you guys wanted to learn about it yourselves, I encourage everybody to do any and all of your own research before you do anything with your money, because ultimately, at the end of the day, you are the one who is responsible for taking control of your own money. Okay, so savings bonds are bonds that you can get from the United States Treasury, and they are intended to mature over decades. So they're intended to mature, I guess, in over 20 or 30 years. And by the time they mature, at least in 20 years, the United States government basically guarantees, quote unquote, guarantees, that the value of the bond will have at least doubled because of compound interest. Any sort of interest that accrues on the savings bond, you will also get the interest from that total as well. My understanding is that you can't redeem savings bonds in the first year that you purchase them or get them, and then if you happen to redeem them in the first 5 years after you get them, you basically forfeit the last 3 months of interest. It doesn't really make any sense as a short term investment. And so that makes savings bonds really not liquid. Here's what I ended up doing. I ended up waiting to cash them because they were actually still in a time period in which they could continue to accrue more interest. And a lot of that was going to be up in 2026, which is the year that I am recording this right now. And I went to the bank. I took the savings bonds in. There wasn't that much. It was like enough for, I'd probably say, a little bit less than one paycheck from my tech job when I had a tech job. But I sat down with the teller and she was able to go ahead and cash everything for me. I ended up depositing it into an account just because what am I going to do with a bunch of cash? Because every payment that I make is mostly a digital payment anyway, so I use a credit card or some other digital wallet. But there was about maybe 10 savings bonds or so, and the entire process took about, I would say, 15 minutes to fully cash from when I said, hey, I want to cash these savings bonds, and I was out the door. So after that, I ended up going home and I did some research on treasury bonds in general. Some of the things really surprised me because I just thought that all treasury bonds were like savings bonds. And boy, was I wrong. So, treasury bonds can have all sorts of different lengths of time, and some of them do mature as well in 20 to 30 years. But there's also way shorter time spans for treasuries. You could even potentially get one as short as a month. So, how do you get them? So, you can just log right on to the United States Treasury website and you can just buy them right there. However, I was thinking, wait, if you wanted to buy a ton of bonds and then you have to take them to the bank and go cash them, that seems like a really cumbersome process. And I'm like, nobody wants to do that. Of course, I'm also thinking like, wait, my mom purchased these like over 30 years ago, like kind of well before the internet was e-commerce and like there were secure financial systems. How did she get the savings bonds? My guess is you would probably go to the bank and then the bank would probably purchase them on your behalf to then give to you, but that's just a guess. All right, so why bonds? This is encompassing both savings bonds and treasury bonds, but the reason why you would consider getting bonds is that they're considered a safe investment because they're fully backed by the United States government and credit. They are also a place where you know that when you invest your money into treasuries, the raw dollar amount that you put in, typically referred to as principal, won't go down. That doesn't necessarily mean that your buying power will not go down, because if the gains from the bonds don't outpace inflation, then definitely the amount of buying power you have does go down. This is better than having your money sit in an account doing nothing. So this is kind of a PSA before we move on. If you have a bunch of money sitting around, typically people might have an emergency fund and it is sitting in an account that doesn't accrue any major interest. If you don't think that you'll be needing that money or touching that money unless absolutely necessary, you should consider putting it into a high yield savings account. I think usually you can just ask your bank to see if that is an option. There might be some weird restrictions, but it's something to think about that's better than hiding your money under the mattress. Which, during the recording of this, I went to say that phrase and I was like, why do people use that phrase anyway? The reason why, and it basically came about during a time in the 1920s, 1930s, and around the time of the Great Depression, where all of the banks collapsed. There were so many bank closures that many Americans ended up taking all of their money out, which exacerbated the banking crash. They ended up hiding their money under their mattress. I think the common belief at the time was that also, if you were sleeping in your house on top of your mattress, it'd be harder for somebody else to steal the money while you were sleeping on top of it. And so there we are. That's why there's that saying, hiding the money under your mattress. Today I learned a thing. Hopefully you did too. And hopefully the learning will continue. So let's get back to the benefits of bonds. So the benefits are that your principal amount doesn't reduce over time. You will get additional value from interest, and the interest can compound. For treasury bonds, they can have varying maturity lengths, so you could have it be in there accruing interest for a long time or a short time. The shorter time limits are actually what give it the ability to be liquid, whereas the savings bonds with decades of maturing time are not. If they were physical bonds, then how would you cash them? Well, the good news is that that's a concern for when paper bonds existed, and now that is no longer an issue. Actually, it's not really been an issue for like 15 years for most of the things, but there's actually one kind of bond that I guess still was issued for tax refunds up until 2025. But that's okay. It's now 2026 and there's no new paper bonds being issued. That doesn't mean that there aren't paper bonds still floating around out there, but for the most part, there's no new paper bonds being issued, and so everything's digital. And so at this point, everything should be pretty easy to manage between purchasing, seeing when they mature. The fact that they're digital prevents like physical damage to them or fire or loss or theft. So let's say you wanted to purchase a $50 treasury bond that matures in a month. You would basically pay a little bit less than $50, and after the month is over, you would then get the full $50. The difference in the amount that you paid, which would be less than $50, and the $50, that would be the interest that you would have accrued during that month. Now, I don't know how true this piece is because I just heard this watching a bunch of different YouTube videos about this very thing. But if you have bank accounts that end up receiving a payment from the US Treasury, sometimes they treat that as a direct deposit. and whether it's actually a direct deposit, because it's quote unquote what a direct deposit is. Most banks will oftentimes treat that as a direct deposit because they see that it's something coming from the US Treasury, and if they see the same amount multiple times, I'm not saying that you can use this information to your heart's content to quote unquote fake direct deposit, but it's just an idea that I came across that I figured was worth mentioning. Obviously, learn all of your bank's rules and regulations and abide by everything in good faith. So, where is this whole discussion going? The entire reason why I wanted to make this episode, I learned about SGOV. SGOV, SGOV, is an ETF. An ETF stands for Exchange Traded Fund. If you've heard of the phrase mutual fund, that is one kind of fund. ETF, that's another kind of fund. So these are different things that you can put money in. They're considered investments. SGOV is an ETF and it's treasury bond based. There are a lot of reasons why, if you want a safe investment but high liquidity, SGOV is an ETF to look at. Once again, remember my disclaimer at the beginning: do your own research, yada yada yada. You're responsible for your own money. If you've never heard of SGOV, this is basically an ETF in which the entire fund powered basically just with short-term bonds. The bonds that are inside of the fund mature somewhere between 0 to 3 months. When you invest in an ETF, you basically buy it like a stock. Subject to how the price changes, the thing about treasury bonds is that they basically always go up. If you actually look at the graph for SGOV over time, every single month you see the price of an SGOV ETF go up, and then at the end of the month there's a very sharp drop and it kind of normalizes the price, and that price difference ends up getting paid out as dividends, and then you repeat the cycle every month. SGOV increases, and then at the end of the month those dividends get paid out, and when it does, the price drops back down. And so here we basically see that we'll maintain our principal amount. It's backed by the federal government. It's very consistent with the short-term maturity lengths. So if we look at the reasons for why we would want to invest in treasuries in the first place, it's low risk, you maintain principal, you have the safety and fully backed credit of the United States government, and it's basically considered liquid. And there's even a bunch of other benefits that I haven't even mentioned. One of which, and this is the reason why you might want to invest in treasuries as well, is that even though the interest on these bonds is taxed federally, the interest is exempt from local and state taxes. If you live in a place where there are high local and state taxes, this is a way to get some interest money that is exempt from the local and state taxes. Now, I looked at a bunch of other financial institutions to see if there are any competitors for SGOV, and yeah, a bunch of different banks and financial institutions do have something where they heavily invest in treasuries that are short-term maturity treasuries. But the one thing that I think sets SGOV apart from all of the other ones is that there's a very low expense ratio. So if you see some other ones, the expense ratio is how much of the money goes into the expenses of maintaining the fund. And so if we take a look, as of right now, this is February 2026, SGOV has a very low expense ratio of 0.09%. The other thing that I think sets SGOV apart is that the other competitors that I looked at that did have short-term treasuries as their primary investments in the fund, they may contain other things that are not 0 to 3 month treasury bonds. And so it might not be as clear cut for the tax benefits. Now I'm looking at the horror stories of missed reportings between state and what can be excluded. And so basically, everywhere indicates that the burden of doing this manual calculation is on you, the tax filer. And so that's why I think this might be a reason why people pay for tax professionals to do their taxes, because this is the kind of thing where you don't want to mess things up. In this case, everything that would come from this fund appears to be all inclusive of US Treasury funds and should hopefully make calculating easier for separating. But it looks like a lot of financial institutions don't really separate or make it easy, especially if you invest in something that is not entirely US Treasury bonds. So anyway, I've now told you about savings bonds, I've now told you about treasury bonds, I've told you about SGOV, I have told you my stories that I wanted to tell, and I've taken you on this research journey that I've gone on, and here we are at the very end. We're climbing back out of the rabbit hole. I'm sorry that parts of this came off as disorganized and kind of rambly, but that's how some of these are probably gonna work. So there you go. Hopefully you learned something. Thank you for listening. Hopefully you enjoyed. You have a glorious day.